Gambino. And Carlo Gambino was the antithesis of both John Gotti and Al Capone, in that he really understood what omerta was all about. Omerta, the oath that we took, was an oath of silence. You're not supposed to even mention Cosa Nostra or Mafia. You never admit that exists. You never talk about it. That's what omerta really is. And he was the epitome of a mob boss who kept that oath. They never caught him on tape, as far as I know. He had nothing like that. And understand this. He was in power from, I believe, 1957 until he passed away in 1976, almost 20 years. I don't think there was any mob boss in history that was able to rule successfully for that long. And during that time, he maintained a very low profile. He didn't want people to know who he was. He didn't live in an ostentatious way. He didn't dress to the nines like both Capone and Gotti. And I keep mentioning Gotti because he's the most obviously well known. He just knew what this life was all about. It had to be a secret life if he was going to survive. Now, let me say this. If it was a different time that he was in, let's say the mid 80s, or even a little bit earlier than that, when the government really started to produce high tech technology, surveillance techniques, and when the RICO statute came into effect in the mid 80s, and the Bail Reform Act and the Sentencing Reform Act, if all of those things were around during Gambino's time, I don't know that he would have survived like he did, because all the mob bosses went down. And it was very, very difficult under those situations. A lot of guys became informants because they got caught on tape, and a lot of stuff was happening. They were facing a lot of time. And you know the story there. We went through that, and other sites have gone through that. So you get it. But during his time, he was able to really rule with an iron fist. He was called Capo Tutti di Capo, meaning the boss of all bosses. I think he was the most respected boss of his era for sure. And so, he's a very interesting guy. Just to go back a little bit. And by the way, I did have the pleasure of meeting him. I was very young. He lived out in Long Island where my dad was. Before my dad got in all his trouble, he visited him at one point in his home in Massapequa, and I happened to be with him. Only met him for a few minutes. He was a gentleman. He was a bit older at that time, probably in his probably late 60s. And I said hello to him. I didn't realize, his authority or who he was, or that he was the boss, or my dad didn't explain anything to me. I just met him and a few other people at that point in time. That was the only time I met him. It wasn't an official meeting, and I certainly wasn't in the life at that time. But again, my impression, nice old man at that point in time. But, to give you a little bit of his history, oftentimes Vito Corleone in The Godfather Who's kind of a composite of a different, of a few mob guys, I would say. He had some similarities with Carlo Gambino. What were those similarities? Well, if you saw the way Vito conducted himself, he was very low key. Very rarely did he raise his voice. He didn't get too excited. He tried to really live up to the oath that he took. In Godfather 2, the way he conducted himself, kind of the same way. And he was kind of, I think, patterned mainly his character after Carlo Gambino. Carlo Gambino, like Vito Corleone, came over here on his own. Yes, he came from Italy, from Sicily. He was Sicilian, like Vito Corleone, and he came to the United States on his own. And when he first came here, I think he went to North Carolina or South Carolina, where his cousins, the Castellanos, were living. I think he stayed with them for a while, and then he went up to New York when they went up to New York, and that's how his kind of life started in New York. When he first got here, young guy, he must have established himself on the streets pretty quickly. Yeah, they say that he committed murders, although they don't give us any murders. They always say, he was a murderer, but they don't tell us about any of the murders specifically that he committed. He did connect with Lucky Luciano and Costello. And by the way, Costello was kind of the same character as Gambino. So I'm wondering if Gambino kind of patterned his style like Costello's. Costello was very low key, even though he was in a lot of political connections. He understood that life. He was, again, another guy that I think was one of the smartest guys in that life. So Gambino connects with them, and they joined a gang called the Young Turks, and it was Luciano and Costello, Gambino, Meyer Lansky was around at the time, Bugsy Siegel. And what happened at that time in New York, they kind of came up against the old timers, the Mustache Pete's, the Mazzaria, the Maranzano. These were the old time guys, and they didn't kind of, like the younger guys. They Represented them in a way. They had their own way of doing things. And the younger guys like Luciano, Costello, Gambino, they did things kind of differently. Well, it led to a war, the Castellammarese War. And it was actually the younger guys fighting the Mustache Pete's and those crews. And it lasted for quite a while. Luciano realized, Costello the same thing. You know what? We're not going to accomplish anything going to war. We got to try to settle this thing and try to resolve this thing. So they sat down with some of the older guys and they did resolve things at that point, but they had another plan in mind. And that plan was they were going to get rid of both Mazzaria and Maranzano and they were going to take over. And eventually that's what they did. They put a hit out on both of them successfully, knocked them both off. And then it was Luciano who was in control with Costello. And you understand what happened at that point. That's when Lucky said, hey, we got to be organized. We have to have an organization here. And he organized the families into what we know Cosa Nostra to be today. He created the commission. Gambino